in detail so you would have a clear understanding of all the events that occurred when the Britannic was sinking. Around 8:37 a.m., Captain Bartlett finally gave the all-clear and ordered the crew to begin lowering away the Britannic's lifeboats. And boy, let me tell you, the Britannic's crew wasted no time in beginning to launch these boats. What you need to understand is, by this point, most of the Britannic's personnel would have already been located on the boat deck waiting for the order to evacuate, and the Britannic's crew would have already had the lifeboats primed and ready to be launched for quite some time now. So once Captain Bartlett gave the all-clear and the lowering away process of these boats began, it wasn't more than a minute before the first lifeboat touched the water. The crew was launching these lifeboats away from the ship at a record rate. Sometimes 3 or more lifeboats all touched the water at the exact same minute. Now, the Britannic had roughly 48 lifeboats on board, and over the span of the next 15 minutes, the crew were able to get most of the people off of the Britannic, and they successfully launched 35 of the Britannic's lifeboats in that short amount of time. Around 8:50 a.m., Captain Bartlett was still on the Britannic's bridge observing the evacuation of his vessel. But he wasn't just observing the evacuation. He was also paying close attention to the rate at which the Britannic was going down. And what he thought he observed was, he thought he noticed that the rate at which the Britannic was sinking seemed to have slowed down a bit. So at this point in time, he decided that he wanted to try one last time to get the Britannic to Kia Island. So, with most of the ship's personnel already off the vessel, he ordered a temporary pause on the evacuation so he could re-engage the Britannic's engines one last time in one final attempt to reach Kia Island. Now, even though he did order the evacuation to be paused, from what information I could find, it does seem like that a few lifeboats did leave the Britannic during this brief window of time that the ship's engines were re-engaged. However, it's important to note that even though some lifeboats were launched from the Britannic during this short period that the engines were re-engaged, the circumstances surrounding how these lifeboats were launched were different than earlier when those lifeboats got sucked into the Britannic's massive propeller. So, what do I mean by this? Well, I'll explain. You see, during this time period, most, but not all of the lifeboats launched were launched from the Britannic's starboard side. So all of the lifeboats launched from this area, remember, the starboard side propeller was never engaged throughout the sinking. So any lifeboats launched from there would have had little to no risk of being damaged from the Britannic's starboard side propeller. Honestly, the only way they could have been damaged by that is if they crashed into it somehow, so they're fine. But now, I did find some records that stated that a few lifeboats were launched from the Britannic's port side during this time period as well. And while I wouldn't do that, it was safer than it was earlier when those lifeboats got pulled into the propeller. You see, at this point in time, the Britannic had a very strong list to starboard, so it was impossible to launch any lifeboats from the Britannic's port side with the regular davits, because these lifeboats would literally grind up against the Britannic's hull, and anybody who was in these lifeboats would have a real risk of being thrown into the sea because these lifeboats could really capsize. The only way to launch a lifeboat from the Britannic's port side at this time period was to use the Britannic's gantry davits, because these davits could lift the lifeboat out further away from the Britannic than what you could do with the regular davit. And you see, here's another thing. Because of the Britannic's sharp list to starboard, that meant that the Britannic's port side propeller was also higher up out of the water. And due to the angle at which the Britannic was currently at, any lifeboats launched from the Britannic's port side would have a much less of a risk of being pulled into the port side propeller. So, as I said earlier, it was still risky to launch a lifeboat from the port side during this time period, but it definitely wasn't as much of a risk as it was earlier in the sinking when those first 2 lifeboats got pulled into the Britannic's propeller. However, at this late stage in the sinking, the forward motion of the Britannic only helped to push the Britannic's bow deeper underwater. It wasn't long before the Britannic's bow and a good chunk of the Britannic's forward well deck were submerged. So, after roughly 10 minutes of Captain Bartlett trying desperately to get the Britannic to the island of Kia, at 9 a.m. he ordered the Britannic's engine stop for one final time and ordered everybody to leave the Britannic. He sounded 2 long blasts of the ship's whistle to let everybody on the ship know it was time to evacuate. This sound was also heard by the men in the engine room, so they knew as well it was time to get out of the Britannic before the ship went down. Captain Bartlett left the Britannic by simply walking out of the bridge and walked to the starboard side bridge wing and simply just stepped off the Britannic and walked into the sea and swam away from the ship as the final plunge was beginning. Right around this time, the Britannic's engineering crew emerged from deep within the ship, walked out onto the deck, and saw the Britannic's forwardmost funnel touching the water. At this point, they simply leapt into the sea and swam away from the Britannic. Once the engineering crew left the ship, there were no more living souls on board the Britannic during the vessel's final moments. As the Britannic's final plunge continued, the Britannic's stern began to rise higher and higher out of the water, eventually exposing all of the Britannic's massive propeller blades. This sight must have been eerily similar to that of the Titanic, which sunk a few years earlier. However, unlike the Titanic, since the Britannic had an initial list to starboard, its starboard list only increased as the final plunge continued. Eventually, the Britannic was laying completely on her side, with her stern sticking up out of the water. Then, as the Britannic began to slowly dip beneath the surface, survivors from the Britannic said they heard a tremendous roar or bang come from the front section of the ship that was already submerged. What this was the Britannic's bow slamming into the seafloor. You see, where the Britannic was over 800 feet long, the ship only sunk in roughly 400 feet of water, so the Britannic's bow hit the seafloor before the stern was completely submerged. Once this occurred, it caused massive structural damage to the Britannic's hull, and you can see evidence of this in the wreck today. There's a massive hole in the Britannic's bow section. Then, at roughly 9:07 a.m., the Britannic's stern slowly dipped beneath the surface, signaling the end to the third ship of the Olympic-class fleet. There were roughly 1,060 people on board the HMHS Britannic during the ship's final voyage, and as a result of the sinking, 30 people would lose their lives when the Britannic went down. Now, don't take what I'm saying out of context here. It is a tragedy that those 30 people lost their lives when the ship sank. However, it is somewhat of a miracle that the loss of life wasn't worse. It really is a testament to the quick actions of Captain Bartlett and his crew that they were able to save so many people when the Britannic went down. And we also can't forget that most of the lives lost on the Britannic were a result of some of the crew members panicking and launching some lifeboats without the captain's permission, and these lifeboats got sucked into the Britannic's massive propeller. Wait a second. I just realized something. Remember earlier in the video when I said that Captain Bartlett ordered the evacuation to be paused while he re-engaged the Britannic's engines to try to get the ship to Kia Island? Well, also remember that I said that some lifeboats were launched during that window of time? So does that mean that there were some crew members who ignored the captain's orders again and continued launching lifeboats? Alright, I'm not going to dive into that. Okay, that's a whole other can of worms that I'm not going to explore in this video. Anyway, guys, I think this is a good place to wrap up the video here. So, hey, thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to leave a like, be sure to subscribe, and thank you all so much for watching this video. You all are awesome. All right, everybody, well, hey, you all stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good day, everybody, and thank you all so much for tuning in. Special thanks to our Captain-level Patreon supporters, Olivia Julius, Greg Gallick, and Callum Whaley. Thank you all so much for all the support.